Hello, everyone online.
Hello.
Good to see you. We're gonna go ahead and get started in a minute. Okay. Okay.
Oh, okay.
But I need to.
Good evening, everyone. I'm gonna go ahead and sit on the chair here until Hillary comes and takes over the tech production here. So yeah, I'm really excited to start a new unit of study in our class. This is one of my favorite things to talk about because it kind of speaks to the core of what I'm interested in like when one's sort of in terms of studying American religion, which is like what are the myths and the sort of narrative motifs that Americans in general think about and align themselves with. And Exodus is like the big one, and that's what we're going to talk about hopefully over the next couple of weeks. Before we begin, everyone online, can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Wonderful. Okay.
Yes.
All right.
Yes.
Anyone know what this is an image of? I mean, other than people standing on a mountain. Yes, it's grapes of wrath. Yes. So this is from obviously the film Grapes of Wrath. This is the Joad family as they enter into California after traveling across the United States on an exodus from Oklahoma during the Great Depression. So of course Steinbeck's based on Steinbeck's novel, and that is an Exodus narrative. It is a narrative that uses themes of the Exodus, in many ways retells the Exodus, and is therefore a representation of the Exodus that is then that is mapped out over American history, American thought, American identity. And so over the next few weeks, that's the sort of thing that we're going to be looking at. How is Exodus used, not just by us as Jews, we all know how we use Exodus, of course, but by other Americans, in particular, African Americans, sort of the dominant American culture, which we can sort of call that derives from American Puritanism. And then we'll probably take a look at the LDS as well. And also how we contemporary Jews engage with, American Jews, I should say, engage with the Exodus story, right? Beyond just having a Seder, which is that's how we do it, but we also think about it. And we think about the story, and hopefully I'll convince you of this after the next few weeks. We think about the story not just as Jews, but as Americans. And that's a really, really cool thing, a really fascinating thing, in both good ways and not so good ways. As you know, when we'll end up talking about things like Manifest Destiny, which are not so great, but are representations of Exodus. Okay. So Exodus is a myth. I have here as an American mythology. Exodus is American mythology. And hold on, come on, screen, there we go. So before we talk about Exodus itself, I want to talk a little bit about what myths are. So maybe we can do some opening discussion. What are your common understandings of myth? What is myth? Does anyone want to offer a definition or an explanation of what myth is? And let me pull up the chat here also. So that's.
Are you recording?
I am recording, yes.
From the literary point of view, myth is anything that explains life.
Wait, hold on, let me go back here. So a myth is
I didn't read your slide, sorry.
Okay. So Alexa said myth is, from a literary perspective, something that explains life. Okay, that's good. Yeah. What else?
It's legend.
A myth is a legend. Very good. What else?
It's a story that evolved over time.
A story that evolved over time. Sherry, what's myth?
It may or may not be true.
Okay, it may or may not be true. Well, here, let me give you. Does anyone want to run the mic? Or run the screen, either way. Okay. Thank you. Okay, I'm gonna give the mic to you.
The characters in Greek mythology
Mhm.
or Roman mythology that have been like got their names already.
The Greek myth.
The Greek the myth of love at love for the guy holding up the world. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so Sherry thinks of Atlas and of Aphrodite or Eros, so these common Greek myths, right? And we usually think of Greek myths. And somebody said online a story that is not true. Or
No,
a
I said it may or may not be true.
may or may not be true, right? Or a religion that oftentimes I hear this, a religion that is no longer, is like a dead religion, like Norse mythology or something of that nature. So yeah, these are sort of common understandings of myth. And from a religious studies perspective, we sort of see those as popular descriptions of myth, and that doesn't mean that they're incorrect. It just means it doesn't necessarily help us from a scholarly perspective when it comes to examining how these myths resonate in our lives, how they resonate on a day-to-day basis for most people who still utilize these sorts of stories. So,
Yeah.
you to look at myth is like from a technical perspective. So myth is not necessarily a story that's not true, or John, you had a comment?
Oh, yeah, I was just saying, we go to the next slide, which I know touches upon what I'm about to say. Like, oftentimes myths are like foundational too. It's like, I've heard people call the Exodus, for example, the foundational myth of the Jewish people. And like, there's certain things that I know you use this word on the next slide, etiological myths or things where like, myths to explain why things came to be, like there are lots of pillars of salt around the Dead Sea, the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, etc.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so we'll sort of dive into that in a moment, but basically, we should look at myth. I'm gonna encourage you as we look at Exodus. I'm really gonna encourage you to look at Exodus in a number of different ways. Not as a story that did or didn't happen, but a story that has other uses beyond, was it real? Is it historically accurate? Did it happen? Because myths help explain all sorts of different things in our lives. They're not just stories that we believe or disbelieve, they are stories that help us structure our lives. And we hold on to all of these myths. So for instance, you give a quick example, what's the American dream? What? So, owning a house, like, the white picket fence, or, getting rich, or anyone can make it to work hard enough. And Alexis quipped just now, she said that's a myth, using myth in the popular colloquial sense of an untrue story, assuming that that's what you were getting at. And yeah, for some people it's not true, for many people, most people it's probably not true, for some people it is true. But the fact of the matter is that most Americans hold on to it in some way. Most Americans are like, yeah, if I work hard, I can really achieve something. That's not to say you won't, that's not to say you don't. It's just to say that it's a story that resonates with us and resonates with our identity. All right, let's move on. Oh, Darren?
Here's a question. Where do you divide myth from non-myth? Since it seems like the line is rather blurred. Some things may not be totally factually correct, but they're, reasonably close. Other things are totally unreasonable.
Trying to help, and I don't even know what
Yeah,
I'm doing.
so whether or not something is true or not, the point I'm trying to make is that it's largely irrelevant. What matters is whether or not people utilize myth or utilize these stories as something that explains
What's
their
your press?
lives.
Just
That's the
left
important
click, but
part.
it's down here.
So thank you, Hill, for going to this particular
Oh.
slide.
Sarah, help
We
me.
can sort of break myth down into these different sort of categories that I think are helpful in understanding this. So class, it's incredibly difficult to run.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. Oh, gotcha. That's all good. I know, right? I'm gonna have to send you out of the class.
Get out of here.
I'm gonna have to send you to the office of the education director. Yeah. So it's just upstairs and straight ahead.
The main office while we go.
All right, so we have these different categories of myth to sort of help break this down and what I mean by this. So the first category is a cosmogonic myth. Cosmogonic meaning speaking to the cosmos, explaining the cosmos. These are our creation narratives. How did the world come into being? So the story in Genesis of the formation of the world, and then subsequently the formation of human beings, the two stories about that in Genesis, those are cosmogonic myths. Or the Hindu myth of Purusha sacrificing himself and creating the world out of his body. A similar myth in Norse mythology of Ymir, the giant who does the same thing. These are all cosmogonic creation narratives. How did the universe come into existence? And oftentimes when we think of myths, when we sort of step beyond just the popular understanding of the untrue story, that's what we think of. We're like, oh, how was the world created? That's like a myth, right? And there's obviously Greek versions of that as well. The next type of myth is what we would call an etiologic myth. And John sort of already hinted at this. He said an etiological myth is a myth that explains why things are the way they are. So the example that you gave was Lot's wife, right? And it turns into a pillar of salt, and that that is a myth that's used to explain why there are these piles of salt around the Dead Sea right now, the region. Another example of an etiological myth would be actually within the creation myth itself, right? Why do we have a week? Why do we have time? Why do we die? Why do why do we have labor, both in the biological sense and in the economic sense, right? These are all etiological explanations within a myth.
Okay, so I have a question. I have a question. So I know that like previously at religious school, we had this discussion about the Noah's Arks, like the story.
Yeah.
Is Noah's Ark, is that considered like one of these myths?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay,
So
thank you.
Noah's Ark very much is, it's ideological taken on face value. If we look at it as it's presented in the Torah, it's an ideological myth. So why, where do the nations come from? Why are there rainbows? That's the big one,
Okay.
right? But also that particular myth is, I don't want to say lifted, but it's a syncretic combination of various Near Eastern myths. And one of them is connected to the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is very much, it has creation narratives within it as well. So the flood myth is both in its sort of technical, there's technicalities. The flood myth is sort of a ideological myth, but it also has cosmogonic components in addition to that. Alexis.
Oh, no.
Okay. So the final one that I want to look at really briefly is what we call an ethnologic myth. And an ethnologic myth would be a peoplehood narrative. How did we come to be who we are? Not how did we come to be mortal, which is like the creation narrative. That's what Adam and Eve, through what happens in the Garden of Eden, they ultimately become mortal. Not like that. But how did we as Jews become Jews? How did one group of people become a group of people? Whatever the group of people may be. So it is a myth that explains who we are and how we see ourselves. And so Exodus is the quintessential ethnologic peoplehood narrative. Now, I'm speaking to a room full of Jews, both virtually and in person, and we all know this. This is like second nature to all of us because one of our most important holidays involves this particular narrative, but also it seems like second nature because it is literally by definition second nature to us. Our whole culture is built around Exodus, and we read our entire story, our historical narrative. Hysterical. I almost said hysterical. Sometimes it's hysterical. Our whole historical narrative is read through the lens of the Exodus narrative. And so it seems like second nature, right? Now, some of the other groups that we're going to look at, that hopefully will be new to all of us, right? That's my hope. The other idea that I want to talk about is microscopic versus telescopic mythology. So anyone want to take a stab at what that means? And online, I want to let you know online, I'm not seeing the chat box, so just shout out and I'll.
I'm watching the.
Oh,
chat.
you are watching? Okay, great, thanks. Okay, so does anyone want to take a stab at what, let's say a telescopic view of a myth, what might that mean?
That would be,
Oh.
would that mean literally telescope as in looking at the wider view?
Yeah.
As opposed to microscope looking at the small. Okay.
That's exactly it. Telescopic means it means looking at the big picture, and microscopic means looking at the small details.
Also called macro.
You could call it that as well. This particular language, Alexis asked if you call it like a macroscopic view. This particular language I'm taking from a scholar of religion, Wendy Doniger, and so like I'm using her terminology. Yeah. So yeah, microscopic versus telescopic, and so what that means is if you're looking at something telescopically, you're looking at it through the big picture, right? What's the big idea? And let's look at the creation narrative for a moment, right? The whole idea, the big picture of creation narrative is this is how the world is created and God sets up like the universe, right? Whereas the microscopic version of the myth, the microscopic attributes of the myth would be the small, we might say, human details. So in the creation narrative, that might include when God is walking through the garden and encounters Adam and Eve and notices that they're clothed and says like, who told you you were naked, right? And then that speaks to sort of a human sense of like vulnerability. Exodus is filled with microscopic and telescopic motifs. So the telescopic motif, Exodus, is about liberty and oppression and being free of bondage and about slavery, about God redeeming God's people. These are the telescopic components. Does anyone want to sort of guess what the microscopic components of the Exodus narrative might be? Plagues. Yeah, in a sense that we might like, yeah, fear the idea of plague. I mean, and certainly during Passover in 2020, I think that absolutely became like with that part of the story narrative resonated with us very personal microscopic level, right? And also, germs are small. What else might be a microscopic approach? Daryl?
Moses' encounter with the Pharaoh.
How so?
Well, it describes this encounter at one point. It's, other whether we don't, it's not whether we feel it's true, but it's something you could visualize as a real one-on-one conversation.
Yeah, so I think also to sort of extrapolate on what you're saying in terms of Moses' encounter with Pharaoh. Yeah, Moses' encounter with Pharaoh is microscopic because he's afraid to confront Pharaoh. He's afraid to speak truth to power. Also, Moses, when God appears to Moses in the form of a burning bush, Moses very famously essentially says, "You can't do this. Send somebody else. I'm slow of speech." Right? He has a fear, whether it's because he has, some. I know that there have been some scholars who have speculated that he had like, some form of like speech pathology or something like that. He has like a stutter, but also, even if that's not the case, here he is being told by a deity, right, to go to the most powerful person in the world at the time and say, hey, your entire structure of society is completely wrong and you need to completely upend it because what you're doing is unjust. That is scary. And all of us can, we understand that fear. We understand that fear when we see instances of injustice. We understand that fear when we have to speak to someone like a boss who's more powerful, right? This is something that deeply resonates with all human beings, and that would be the microscopic component. So yeah, let's.
Do you want me to click on this?
Do I want you to click on it? Yeah, I really, we have so much trouble playing videos and sometimes folks online can't hear them. So I'll tell you what, if you are online or in person, if you text me or send me an email, I will send you the clips so you can see them. What this particular clip is,
Sorry.
what that clip was, it was from Prince of Egypt. It was Moses, basically the burning bush scene of the story from Prince of Egypt. Okay, so myth has to do with time. In most cultures, myth takes place outside of time. So if you look at something like the Bhagavad Gita, which is a really critical, important, religiously important Hindu myth, that particular story takes place in some prehistory that's not really well defined. It's just sort of outside of history. There's kind of a sense of like a cyclical component of like Hindu cosmology, and there isn't like a time where it takes place. But some myths, that's not the case. Some myths take place within history. Exodus is one of them. Exodus takes place in a very specific timeline. If I had like I should use my my religious director fund to buy a whiteboard for like on wheels or something like that. If I had a whiteboard, I would put this up right now. Exodus takes place in a very specific timeline. It takes place during Bronze Age, right? It takes place somewhere between 1800 BCE to 1400 BCE, depending on how, you know, a biblical scholar might be counting the years in the Exodus narrative. And this is one of the things that we start to ask, is it historically verifiable? This is the thing that people get hung up on, because if it takes place in this time, on this timeline, right, to use a popular way of conceiving that sort of thing, then there should be some sort of evidence for it. And whether or not there is up for debate. But the fact of the matter is that, at least from my perspective, and hopefully, you know, you'll all come to feel this way as well if you don't already, it doesn't matter if it is historically true or not. Right now, it's easy to look at a myth like the Bhagavad Gita and say, oh, it's a myth, it's just sort of out there in some like, you know, different cosmic setting. But Exodus, that's not the case. Exodus is in the here, if not the now. And so how do we approach it if there, I'll sort of spoil this for you, there is not historical, archaeological, scientific evidence for Exodus. There's not. It's not there, it doesn't exist, as far as we know. And yet, this is such an important story. It's important to me. It's my favorite story. I make a very big deal about it when I teach it, both to college students and here, right? I celebrate it every single year with much enthusiasm. And I kind of see my whole worldview is shaped by it. So it's still important, even though I don't believe it happened. Because the reality is that it doesn't really matter if a myth is true or not. I have these phrases up here. Myths are ancestrally true. Not meaning it actually happened to our ancestors, but that our ancestors went through things, went through trials and tribulations and had experiences that align with the themes of the Exodus narrative. The Exodus narrative makes our ancestors' experience more poignant and more powerful, and therefore makes our experiences more poignant and more powerful. Myths are also classical epics. Sherry mentioned a few of them before. These stories we know instinctively are important. They're not just like, a paperback novel that we pick up at the airport, although oftentimes there's mythic elements in those as well. Human beings love stories. This is how we think about the world. Our whole way of understanding the world is from the perspective of understanding stories. And so even these classical epics that we don't believe anymore, they still have components of truth to them, right? I'm trying to think of a Greek myth that has elements of truth. It doesn't matter. There are. Oh, yeah. So, okay. I'll let you do the mic.
So I think at the end of Troy, there actually is archaeological evidence that the city actually exists, and the various versions of it as well. So they can actually go back through and see the letters of each version of Troy, which gives truth to the Odyssey and the Iliad that Homer was written by Homer.
Let me ask you though, we have to follow up. What are the
I can't hear what she's saying.
People are saying that they can't hear Sarah.
Okay. Sarah gave here's the Odyssey as an example, mentioning that Troy actually exists, and that's totally true. Troy is a real place, was a real place. And so there are certain myths where there is historical veracity. And that's why I sort of mentioned to Daryl a little while ago, and I will press this point again. It's not that we look at these stories and we say they're not true. So how else can we use them? No, it's that it doesn't matter if it's true. What matters is that we use them, right? And also how we use them. They can be used for very negative purposes, including Exodus. Manifest Destiny would be an example of that.
We had a question in the chat. Someone wanted to know if we're missing some slides.
Are you not seeing the slides online?
No, the only thing that I see is the same one of Exodus, the Job family looking out onto the horizon.
That's bizarre. That shouldn't be happening.
What, maybe if I stop
stop the
sharing
share and
and then I'll
try it
share
again,
again,
yeah.
yeah.
And it was like, we might want to look into it, crap.
Okay, so Sarah just informed me that there's been some issues with Zoom lately, and that was happening in some of our other programming. So hopefully we can figure it out.
Sarah, do you mind helping?
Let's see, we'll take a 5 minutes. No, let's get this, see what we can do here.
Okay,
So, go, were you playing the slide? You were actually playing the slideshow, right? Yeah. So go up to where it says slideshow.
Hold on, folks.
Okay, now go back to Zoom.
yeah, wait a second. Okay. Zoom. We're gonna share.
Share screen.
The word.
Go to where?
I'm gonna not use the.
Share screen.
So Jenna, I see that you're on. This is what happens when you're not here to help. The whole
There.
synagogue falls apart.
I guess I'm honored.
To here, go over to here
No,
and
yeah,
do
go for it.
slideshow. Are you
This is
guys able to
pause.
see
This
it
says
now?
it's pause.
Can you see this?
It's loading, yeah.
There, now we see it.
Okay, great. Cool. All right. Anyway, so the point I was trying to make, the point that we were all making, thank you, Sarah, thank you so much. The point that we were all making is that it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if the story is historically true or not. What matters is that it is emotionally true, psychologically true, culturally true, you know. Yeah, and also, yeah, especially true, meaning does it allow us to connect to our ancestors, to those who came before us. Also, what makes it real, oh, here you go.
Like an old wives' tale too?
So Sandra asks, would that account for like an old wives' tale, like superstitions? Yeah, to a certain degree. Because that is a way that people live their lives. I would say maybe we call them little myths, or maybe not a microscopic view of a myth, but like a microscopic myth, right? And then they would, so yeah, that would absolutely, I think that would work in that particular instance. What's that? Oblivionism. Okay, so the other thing that's really important is that what makes it real is how the story is told. So I don't know if you've ever been to a Seder that just kind of sucked, right? It's just, it either went on forever and there was no spiritual.
John, we're all members of CBT, so yeah. I mean,
Whoa.
sorry,
Did y'all hear that?
I couldn't resist.
So, was that Barbara?
Yes, that was Barbara.
Yeah, so one of our esteemed board members just said, well, we're all members of CBT, so of course they would understand the Seder. I can't even repeat it. No, that was funny. Thank you, John. John says it was actually the Froker family, it was that side of the family, yeah. So so we've all been to that sort of Seder. Likewise, we've all been to Seders that have been enjoyable, spiritually uplifting. And the perfect Seder is something that isn't too long, right? You don't have to wait super, super long, but also doesn't just rush, we don't just rush through it. I've always been annoyed by those like 30-second Seders, that go around, social media every spring. Or I've always been annoyed when like during our family Seder, where some family member comes up to myself or Jenna and is like, well, are we gonna get through this quickly so we can just eat? And like, I hate that, because the whole purpose is to tell a story. Now, obviously, cultural context matters. We may not enjoy an Orthodox Seder, and they probably wouldn't enjoy our Seder, but the fact of the matter is that within our cultural context, a Seder is good if the storytelling is good. That the same thing goes for myth. A myth is real. A myth is pertinent if the story is told well. Because if the story is told well, it resonates with us emotionally. And also, each retelling is a representation of the myth. And the whole idea of representation is fascinating to me, because Exodus itself, the story in the Torah, is itself a representation. It's a representation of those events, however those events unfolded, or whatever events did unfold that gave rise to the story that was passed down orally from generation to generation, and then eventually around the time of the exile sort of coalesced into this broader text that we call the Torah. Okay. So I have these slides up here because I never know if people know the story. I'm guessing that most of us know the story, but that's okay. So let's do this. Rather than me lecturing the whole story, let's tell the story. So does anyone want to be brave enough to begin the story? But for my college students, I started here with like the ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, Leah, Zilpah. But we can jump ahead a little bit. We can jump ahead maybe to Joseph's death and this phrase here that happens right at the end of this sort of happy communal event of everyone coming together in Genesis, where all the Israelites go down to their new home in Egypt and everything's great. And then the first paragraph of Exodus is, and there arose a Pharaoh who did not know Joseph. So let's start there. Let's tell the story. Who wants to be brave and start? On line 2. John just asked to be a horseradish. Nobody wants to be brave? You tell it every year. Okay, all right. I guess I will tell the story. I'm kind of bummed right now, to be honest with you. I'm going to shame all of you. You all should be ashamed of yourself. Like, it's one thing for undergraduates. No, I'm kidding. Okay, I just stepped over a line and made it actually sounded like I was shaming you, and that wasn't what my intent was. All right. So basically, yeah, the story really begins with Joseph's death and the Israelites being in, everyone going down to Egypt, and the Israelites doing really well for themselves in Egypt, and they multiply, and they have many children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. And over time, Egyptian society forgets all the good that Joseph did for Pharaoh and for Egypt, and how Joseph, through his dreams and his amazing bureaucratic skills, which what it comes down to, is able to usher both Egypt and the ancient Near East through this enormous famine. And this is forgotten over time. So you want to skip to the next slide? Okay. So a new Pharaoh arises, and this new Pharaoh is concerned by the proliferation of the Israelites, and is worried that the Israelites are going to overtake Egyptians, are going to rise up against Egyptians, right? Are basically going to change Egyptian society, or maybe even destroy Egyptian society. And so this Pharaoh, what he does is he orders the death of all of the Hebrew baby boys. And initially, he does this twice, and he actually is foiled by some very clever Hebrew midwives, which, look that story up when you have a chance. It's a great story. I won't go too much into that. When it is clear that it's not working, he actually orders another sort of genocide of the Hebrew children, and the baby boys in particular, and he orders that they are thrown into the Nile River, and this is carried out. So in response to this, Moses' mother puts him into a basket, right, basket of reeds, and floats him down the Nile River, and he is chased by his sister Miriam, who ensures ultimately that, or she doesn't ensure it, but ultimately the basket is washed up into Pharaoh's household, where Moses is taken out from the water, and that's what Moses means in ancient Egyptian, from the water, or drawn from the water. He's brought up from the water by Pharaoh's daughter, and he's raised in the pharaonic household. His mother, Miriam, sort of convinces Pharaoh's daughter to allow Moses' mother to be a wet nurse. So he's not completely broken off from his family, but ultimately he is raised as a royal, as the cartoon says, Prince of Egypt, right? Maybe not an actual brother to Pharaoh like it is in the cartoon, but he's raised in the utmost privilege of Pharaoh and of royalty. All right. hold on, I'll stay there for 1 minute. Okay, sorry, I sort of trying to like get my, like what my writing was cluing me into saying. So Moses is raised this way, and then one day he's walking out among I'm sorry, I forgot to mention. Before Pharaoh kills all of the Hebrew children, the people are put into slavery. That's like the important part. I probably shouldn't have forgotten that part, but I think we all know that part, so I don't have to worry about you not knowing that. Of course, the people are enslaved. And so one day Moses is walking around the architectural projects, and he sees an Egyptian overseer beating a Hebrew slave. And he picks up the jawbone of a donkey and he beats the overseer to death. And then becomes afraid that Pharaoh is going to order his death. And so he escapes into the desert. He runs off the desert and he wanders in the desert until eventually he takes up with a tribe of Midianites. And as well, he's with this tribe of Midianites that he actually becomes a shepherd for a while. He marries the head of the Midianite, Jethro or Yitro. He marries his daughter, Zipporah, and he starts a new life for himself in exile, right? Basically from the privileged life he had as a prince of Egypt. But while he's there, God awakens the suffering of the Hebrews in Egypt. And decides that God is going to step in. And this is when God reveals God's self to Moses in the form of the burning bush. All right. And of course, God tells Moses to go down to Egypt, tell Pharaoh to let my people go. And Moses returns to Egypt, tells Pharaoh to let the people go. Pharaoh doesn't listen to him. Moses, through Aaron, does the trick with the staff. Basically, they cast their staff down, it becomes a serpent. The Egyptian magicians do the same thing, and then it's time for the plagues. So everyone have their glass of wine so they can like. I'm going to jump through this. Like this part you all know because we do this during the Passover Seder. But if you want me to stop, tell me to stop, and I can explain a part of this.
Want me to go to the next?
Yeah, go to the next slide. Finally, after the 10 plagues, in particular the death of the firstborn, I gotta say something about the death of the firstborn actually. I had a professor in college, a religious studies professor, who said it was right before Passover, and I thought it was a joke at the time, like in retrospect it wasn't. He was like, oh, it's Passover, it's the celebration of the genocide of the Egyptians, like referring to the death of the firstborn, which is like, it was incredibly offensive, yeah? I was a kid, so I didn't like know what to say. But yeah, it's incredibly offensive. It's incorrect, but it's also fundamentally incorrect, right? Not just because it's a myth. This is a myth that didn't actually happen, but also because there's a sense of balance to what happens. Pharaoh starts it with first the death of the Hebrew babies, and second, enslavement, right? This is started by Pharaoh. So it was a complete, utter misreading, but I hear that misreading a lot in social media spaces, and it's really kind of frustrating. If you have ever heard the part of the story, the death of the firstborn, and been like, I'm uncomfortable with that, well, first of all, you should be uncomfortable because it is an uncomfortable passage in the narrative. But second of all, the purpose of that passage is to, yes, highlight God's power, but also bring balance to the story, right? To bring balance to the course. No, that ultimately is the purpose of it, right? Pharaoh starts this with his genocide, and then the angel of death finishes it. Okay, so following that, Pharaoh relents and lets the people go, but then ultimately changes his mind and gives chase. And God leads the people by day with a pillar of cloud and by night with a pillar of fire. And this motif is important because it will pop up again in all sorts of representations of Exodus. A few of that which we'll look at. And this pillars of cloud and fire lead the people to the sea, to the shores of the sea, and then Moses lifts up the staff and the sea parts. God's power works through Moses. The sea parts, the Israelites go forward across the sea. The Egyptians give chase. Israelites are safe. The sea falls back on the Egyptians, right? It's a very, very powerful imagery. It's like an enormous miracle. And then the sort of the ultimate, that's the penultimate miracle. The ultimate miracle is freedom, right? The Egyptian forces are destroyed and the Israelites are free. That is the Exodus. The next part of the story, right? The golden calf, the giving of the Torah, that's part of the Exodus narrative. But when we specifically refer to the Exodus itself is the crossing of the sea, right? They've gone on Exodus from Egypt. Now they remain in exile in a sense, right? The Israelites remain wandering in the desert, but the Exodus itself are these dramatic events that we celebrate on the holiday of Passover. Any questions so far? Sharon?
Sorry to come out with something that absolutely most people, say to me, "Oh no, you're wrong, Jerry." But every time I read the story in our Exodus, it comes like this: God is responsible for all the bad things that happen along the way. God does it, not Pharaoh. God does. God wants the Jews to have to fight for their freedom.
Well, I think you also bring up an interesting point that the narrative says, and this is something, hold on to this idea because it will pop up again when we talk about the experience of Exodus in American context. But the narrative, there are parts of the text which say that God hardens Pharaoh's heart. So every time Pharaoh or Moses goes to Pharaoh and says, "Let my people go," sometimes it will say Pharaoh hardens his heart. Other times, his own heart. Other times it says God hardens Pharaoh's heart. And that implies that Pharaoh doesn't have a sense of free will, that God is making this happen. And there's all sorts of rabbinic, and for that matter, Christian, because they use this narrative as well, apologetics for that. I leave you to wrestle with that on Passover. This could be a conversation you can have around the Passover table. What I would say though is that there are times when God does make this happen, and there are other times when Pharaoh chooses. God does not make Pharaoh kill the Israelite babies. God does not make Pharaoh enslave the Israelites. And God doesn't even make Pharaoh say you can't go every single time. He does it a few times. It's an ambiguous story. It's a myth that was written during the Bronze Age. The purpose of its writing was it was kind of one of the interesting things about myths written during this time frame in the Middle and the Near East is that a lot of these myths were written as a type of geopolitical propaganda, which is to say, look at how powerful our God is. Our God destroyed and laid waste to Egypt. So you stay away from us. You don't come into the Judean hills. You stay away from us. Because if our God could do that to Egypt, think of what God is going to do to you, puny Moabite. So, and you see this not just among the Israelites, you see this among lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of Near Eastern communities, right? Whether we're talking about tribes or major city-states and empires. This is a very, very common motif. All right. So the rest of the story, I'm just going to sort of jump through this really quickly. You have the giving of the law at Sinai, the golden calf incident. So basically the Israelites go to Mount Sinai and Moses goes up onto the mountain where he receives the Torah. And this is what the holiday of Shavuot commemorates. He receives the Torah and then he receives the Ten Commandments, right? And then he goes down and he sort of looks out over the people and sees that the people are dancing around a golden calf. Why are they dancing around a golden calf? Well, while Moses was up on the mountain, the people were afraid that he was dead and said that this God clearly, has forsaken us. We need a new God. And so they asked Aaron to build a golden calf out of their jewelry. And Moses sees that and he throws the tablets down. If God wants to destroy the people, and Moses ultimately convinces God not to destroy the people. And there's all sorts of mishigas that happens with that, including the Levites killing 1,000 people. So it's a big, mess of a story. But that's part of this particular story as well. Then the people wander for 40 years. This is so that they can live under God's law, so that they can understand how to follow the Torah, essentially, at least according to the narrative. And then at the very end of the Torah, the actual Torah, we just read it. We read it on Simchat Torah. Moses dies on a mountaintop. And that's again another important motif, Moses dying on the mountaintop. So this prophet of the people is allowed to see the promised land, the land that was promised to Abraham and Abraham's descendants, and was promised to the Israelites. Moses, who leads the people out, is allowed to see the promised land, but is not allowed to enter. Yeah, it's sad, right? It's very sad. I want you to hold that idea. I don't know when we're going to get to this is going to sort of come for a full circle, but hold on to this idea. Moses is allowed to see the promised land, but is not allowed to enter. And this is an important motif. Sit with it for a couple of weeks. We'll come back to it.
Yeah, the golden calf reminds me of the defining moment in Jewish essence of religion, because all religions seem to have an object to worship, and in this story, the golden calf, we get rid of that. We're the only ones that do that. Well, I don't want to say, but they do.
Yeah. So I'm not going to dive much into like a whole lot of biblical criticism, because that would just leave us in some really endless morass, boring discourse. But essentially, most Near Eastern traditions at this time had these golden effigies. The idea of a god who wasn't represented in a iconic physical form is a later idea that it's not the Israelites who develop it, the Jews develop it when we are in exile, right? And when encountering Zoroastrianism. And so this idea is brought back after the exile. There also are elements of Greek philosophy that are woven into it later on. So when these stories are written, they are written with the intent of saying this type of worship is wrong. The type of worship we do is right. Even though the original Israelites, I don't even want to say almost certainly, they certainly had golden effigies. There's actually some really, I might have one in a later slide. If I don't, I'll try to find it for you. An actual representation of the god El, right? When we say El or Elohim, that's who we're referring to. This originally is a Sumerian storm or a Sumerian sky deity, right? And the Israelites will take this deity and they'll actually make representations of it. The later Israelites, and then when the Israelites will be known as Jews, it's at that point that that type of iconography is built. And the golden calf incident, when it's written into the Torah, that is reflective of that sentiment. Yeah. Okay, so then finally, the entrance to Canaan and everything that happens later on. What happens when the Israelites take over the promised land? How do they envision, how do they realize the land that God promised to them? And is it truly a land, when you actually have the actual historic kings of Israel, is it truly a land that is reflective of the themes of the Exodus? And the answer to that is not really. And that's what the prophecies are all about. And we'll come to that too. All right. So yeah, we're going to skip past this one. We just read it on some platform. Okay. All right. Any questions before I move on? So Exodus, I kind of spoke to this already. It is one of the most well-known narratives in Western culture. We see it again and again and again in all sorts of Western works of art and works of literature. It's important or even foundational to the three big Levantine monotheisms, or what we might sometimes call the Western traditions, that being Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. All three of them use the Exodus in some form of theology. I know that Moses as a prophet is mentioned more times in the Quran than Muhammad is, right? He's the most commonly mentioned prophet in the Quran. Christianity, the whole theology of Christianity, the idea of redemption from sin, only works if the Exodus is in place. The idea of being redeemed from bondage. This bondage, or sin is seen as bondage, and death is seen as bondage in Christianity. Christianity only works through the lens of the Exodus. So these three traditions, and we know how it works for us, we understand. These three traditions, Exodus is important, or in some instances, in case of Christianity and Judaism, certainly it's foundational. It's also an inversion of the hero's journey. So what is the hero's journey? Anyone want to speak to the hero's journey? So the hero, Alexis? Oh, The hero's journey is a literary motif, examining, sort of mythic figures and mythic narratives. And the idea of the hero's journey is there's like this figure, this hero who is born often, who's a child of like a king, right, a child of royalty, is born in exile, and then has to go through this, these trials and tribulations, and oftentimes there's like mystical elements as well, in order to be brought back to their authentic place as in their rightful head of the kingdom, right? So we see this in like the Odyssey, right? This is an example of the hero's journey. Or Star Wars is a perfect example of the hero's journey. Like Luke Skywalker is the child of Queen Amidala and Anakin Skywalker, and is essentially royalty, but is raised in obscurity, and then goes on this journey to realize his true potential as like, the super powerful Jedi and the savior of the galaxy. Exodus is an inversion of that. What do I mean by inversion? What I mean is that Moses is not born into royalty. Moses is born into slavery, but is raised in royalty. And is raised outside of obscurity. He's raised in like all the privileges of the royal household, right? And then he goes on this journey outside. He goes into exile from this in order to realize his true potential, which is a leader, a prophet of essentially a bunch of nameless people. They don't have the name Israelite yet, until they go to Mount Sinai. A bunch of former slaves, the lowest of the low. And this is how the Israelites see themselves. Or this is how, I'll actually come to that shortly. This is how we sort of see Moses. He's like an inversion of the hero's journey. And then, of course, we have all these themes that are permeated throughout Western cultures and all the literature of Western cultures: oppression, liberation, promised land, redemption. And this is heavily represented and reproduced in art and media throughout Western culture. Well, you want to jump forward? So here's a few examples of it represented in animation. I have this slide up here because I know that I teach mostly Gen Z and millennials, very few millennials anymore, actually, mostly Gen Z. Yeah, the millennials are the old ones. But ultimately, these these animated versions of the story are the ones that are most familiar to the millennial and Generation Z generations, right? So there was like a Family Guy episode of it. Very famously, there was a Rugrats version of it. There is, of course, The Prince of Egypt, which when I teach this to classes, everybody knows that version of it. It really is probably, I would say, more popular than the Ten Commandments, at least among younger generations. And then I have like Disney's Moana here. And how many of you, has anyone seen Moana? A couple of you have? Moana? Moana? Yeah. So when you saw it, were you thinking, oh, that's Exodus?
No.
I was thinking it's similar to all the other.
Disney.
No.
Oh. Okay, so Alexis was saying it was similar to other myths when she saw it. And yeah, it absolutely is. There's a hero, it is not an inversion of hero's journey. It is hero's journey, but it also is Exodus. It's all, we might say it's an inverted Exodus. So Moana has to bring her people out of exile on this island to their true place, which is roaming the seas, right? Crossing the seas. She has to cross a sea to get where she's going to go. And then, of course, you don't create something and not refer to you don't create the parting of the sea, right? And then say it's not about the Exodus. That's the most recognizable Exodus motif. And in this particular image, there's this fire demon named Tikka in this, and that's the pillar of smoke and the pillar of fire, right? And so these are the motifs that and then there's Moana holding up like this magical stone, just like Moses held up the staff. Yeah.
I had no idea.
Yeah. All right. So famously represented in film, we've seen so many of them. The most famous one, of course, is the Ten Commandments. That's a clip from the Ten Commandments. It's Charlton Heston confronting Pharaoh. So again, if you want to see these clips, send me an email. I'll send them to you. Don't send it. And then, of course, I don't know if any of you ever saw Exodus, Gods and Kings. Yeah, Christian Bale. Yeah, it was absolutely garbage film. It's terrible. He was okay.
Really?
Yeah, the CGI was kind of cool, but like the story itself was terrible. Yeah, you'd think it would be good because he's amazing, but no, it was awful. So anyway, that's another Exodus representation. Not all of them are good. Yeah. Okay, now we start getting into some American representation of Exodus. Right. So I forgot Mel Brooks, right? You may have seen this image before, right? This is called Tragic Prelude, by John Stewart Curry, written or painted in 1940, and it depicts it's supposed to depict John Brown. John Brown, of course, is a famous abolitionist who storms, what is it, Harper's Ferry? Was that, yeah, and it was a weapons depot, right? In order to begin to overthrow and abolish slavery violently, right? And so it's seen by many in the civil rights movement, it's seen as a type of prophetic type of figure, because this happens, what he does happen before the Civil War, but his actions allude to the Civil War, basically. And Curry is drawing him, is painting him as a Moses type figure. And what do I mean by that, right? Well, first of all, I guess aside from the fact that there's, you see the Civil War in the background here, you see sort of on this side there are flames, which refer to the pillar of fire, and then you see smoke, and this obviously is a reference to the destruction of the Civil War and the destruction of slavery, but also, again, these the fire and smoke motifs are part of Exodus representations. And John Brown is depicted like a prophet, right? Carrying not a staff, but a rifle in one hand, and not the Ten Commandments, but the Bible in the other. I'm pretty sure that's the Bible. Yeah. Yeah. I'm sorry. Yeah. So yeah, you can see, Alpha and Omega. So it's definitely like a Christian approach to it, to be sure. But at the same time, it is Exodus that's being depicted. He's being depicted as a type of Moses-like figure who is like the first individual to, that's not true, he wasn't the first abolitionist, to be sure. But he's like a prophetic figure that is bringing about an end to slavery in America. What's that?
Slavery's life.
Slavery.
The Elijah coming before the Messiah.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
This one?
Yeah. Okay. So here's some other representations. One is from the Torah itself. We see it whenever we read Shirat Hayam, the Song of the Sea. Last year Rabbi Young would have read it, and when it was held off, how was it described? What is happening here? Aside from this being that passage of Exodus. Why is it drawn this way or written this way in the Torah? Here, John, I'll give you the link.
It represents the sea with the people in between, the two sides of the sea.
Thanks, Barbara. I don't know if you've heard of John. He said, thanks, Barbara. Yes, it represents the people passing by on two sides of the sea. So remember, I showed you Moana, and I'm like, you don't draw the, you don't create the parting of the waters without alluding to the Exodus. Well, the writers of the Torah, the scribes of the Torah knew this, to be sure, right? Because this is basically the same type of representation as Moana. It's the part of the sea, and the people going through, and the walls of water on either side. That is the representation of Exodus, an artistic representation.
I'm saying this right. My memories of it was when Harriet Tubman in the movie that I watched on TV takes her group, it reminded me of Moses and the water. And she takes the group and they don't want to go in. They don't want to go in, but somehow one does it. And then they all do it after the water has filled up, and this is just like the what? Just like the Exodus story.
Yeah, it was Exodus. It was intentional. It was intentionally written that way because there you have another representation of Exodus. Chagall works elements of Exodus into his crucifix paintings. I can do a whole class on Chagall's crucifixes. Maybe we'll do that sometime. But the elements of Exodus that are in that are the pillars of smoke and the pillars of fire and the masses of people sort of gathering around this Christ-like figure who is sort of Christ, but is also the idea of like, the European destruction of Jewish life. But there are Exodus motifs in this as well. There's a famous opera by Schoenberg called Moses und Aaron, which is both about the Exodus, but also has Holocaust elements to it, because of course, the Holocaust is going to be read in some instances through the lens of Exodus. Moses from the Monotheism, which is a book by Sigmund Freud. And I'm surprised no one brought up this theory. Maybe it will be brought up as we talk about the historicity of Exodus. But basically, Freud comes up with this idea that Moses was an Egyptian priest, and then under Akhenaten, and then has to flee with his people into the desert. And that's so. And he works his psychological, psychoanalytic theories into it, and that would be Moses and monotheism. All right. Oh wow, it's 8 o'clock. Okay, so we're gonna stop here. This is actually a good place to stop because the next few slides are getting into American representations of Exodus, which is really the meat and potatoes of this section of the course. But before we end, are there any last minute questions or comments, online especially?
Thank you.
Okay. Anyone in the room? All right. Well, everyone, thank you so much. I'm going to post a preview to what we'll talk about next week on Facebook, so you can see that. And then also, please reach out to me if you want to see some of those clips. Have a good night. Good to see everybody.
Sorry with the routing.
So I end, right?
And click out the chat. Again.
Oh, I don't think.
You're welcome.
And